The year is 1918. Imagine the Western Front, a place where the very earth seems to groan under the weight of endless conflict. A desolate wasteland, scarred by years of relentless warfare. The ground is churned and broken, a testament to the ferocity of the battles fought here. Millions of soldiers are trapped in a deadly stalemate, their lives hanging in the balance as they wait for the next command, the next push, the next moment of terror. The air is thick with the stench of death, a mix of decaying bodies and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Gas attacks are a constant threat, forcing soldiers to wear masks that make breathing a struggle. The deafening roar of artillery fire is constant, a never-ending barrage that shakes the ground and rattles the nerves of even the most hardened soldiers. Soldiers huddle in trenches, cold, wet, and terrified. They write letters home, trying to maintain a connection to a world that seems impossibly distant. They are surrounded by mud, rats, and the constant threat of enemy attack. The trenches are infested with vermin, and disease is rampant. Every day brings new horrors. The sight of fallen comrades, the screams of the wounded, the relentless bombardment, it all takes a toll on their minds and bodies. Every day brings them closer to breaking point. Exhaustion is etched into their faces, and despair is a constant companion. For 4 long years, the First World War raged across Europe. The scale of the conflict was unprecedented, drawing in nations from around the globe. From the bloody battlefields of the Somme to the icy wastelands of the Eastern Front, millions fought and died. Each battle brought new levels of devastation and loss. The world had never seen such carnage. Entire cities were reduced to rubble, and the landscape was forever altered by the scars of war. Hope seemed lost in the face of such overwhelming destruction. The human spirit was tested to its limits, and many wondered if the world would ever recover. The war had dragged on for far too long. Soldiers and civilians alike were weary, longing for an end to the suffering. Entire nations were bled dry, resources were dwindling. Morale had plummeted, the strain of war was felt in every corner of society. The world yearned for peace, but peace seemed elusive. Protests and uprisings began to spread as people demanded an end to the bloodshed. The fighting continued, relentless and brutal. Each side was determined to outlast the other, no matter the cost. By the summer of 1918, the tide began to turn. The Central Powers, who had once seemed invincible, were now facing insurmountable challenges on multiple fronts. The relentless pressure from the Allied forces was beginning to show its effects, and the cracks in their once formidable defenses were becoming more apparent with each passing day. The Allied powers, bolstered by the fresh troops and resources of the United States, launched a series of powerful offensives. These new American forces brought not only manpower, but also a renewed sense of hope and determination. The infusion of fresh troops and supplies revitalized the weary Allied soldiers, giving them the strength to push forward with renewed vigor. The German army, exhausted and demoralized, began to crumble. The relentless bombardments and continuous assaults had taken a heavy toll on the German soldiers. Many were young and inexperienced, having been hastily conscripted to replace the mounting casualties. The morale among the troops was at an all-time low, and desertions became increasingly common. Their allies, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, were on the verge of collapse. The internal divisions within these empires were exacerbated by the strains of war. Ethnic tensions and nationalist movements were tearing Austria-Hungary apart from within, while the Ottoman Empire was struggling to maintain control over its vast and diverse territories. The Hundred Days Offensive, a series of decisive Allied victories, shattered the German lines. This relentless campaign, marked by coordinated attacks and strategic maneuvers, left the German forces reeling. The Allies advanced rapidly, capturing key positions and breaking through previously impregnable defenses. One by one, German strongholds fell. The once formidable fortifications that had withstood years of conflict were now crumbling under the relentless pressure. The German army, unable to mount an effective defense, was forced to retreat, abandoning their positions and leaving behind a trail of destruction. The German army was in full retreat. The once proud and disciplined force was now a shadow of its former self, struggling to regroup and hold the line. The retreat was chaotic, with units becoming separated and communication breaking down. The sense of impending defeat was palpable among the ranks. The dream of German domination in Europe lay in ruins. The grand ambitions of the Central Powers had been dashed, and the reality of their situation was stark. The war had brought unprecedented destruction and suffering, leaving entire towns and cities in ruins. The once vibrant landscapes of Europe were now scarred by the ravages of war. Faced with mounting losses and dwindling supplies, the German leadership realized the war was unwinnable. The High Command, once confident in their strategies, now grappled with the harsh reality of their situation. The logistical challenges were insurmountable, and the morale of both the troops and the civilian population was at an all-time low. The writing was on the wall. Defeat was inevitable. The German leadership, recognizing the futility of continuing the fight, began to consider the terms of surrender. The once unthinkable prospect of capitulation was now the only viable option to prevent further devastation. Peace, even a humiliating one, was the only option. The negotiations were tense and fraught with emotion as the German leaders grappled with the reality of their defeat. The terms were harsh, but they offered a glimmer of hope for an end to the suffering and a chance to rebuild. They had staked everything on a gamble, and they had lost. The Central Powers, once a formidable force, were now a shadow of their former selves. The soldiers, weary and defeated, laid down their arms, marking the end of a brutal and devastating conflict. The Central Powers, once a formidable force, were collapsing from within. The internal divisions and the relentless pressure from the Allies had taken their toll. The once united front was now fractured, and the leaders of the Central Powers were left to grapple with the consequences of their failed ambitions. Austria-Hungary, torn apart by internal strife, was on the brink of disintegration. The various ethnic groups within the empire were demanding independence, and the central government was powerless to stop the tide of nationalism. The once mighty empire was now a patchwork of conflicting interests and simmering tensions. The Ottoman Empire, weakened and fragmented, was unable to continue the fight. The centuries-old empire, already struggling with internal dissent and external pressures, was now facing its final days. The soldiers, demoralized and outnumbered, had no choice but to surrender. The war, once a symbol of national pride, had become a nightmare. The initial fervor and enthusiasm had long since faded, replaced by a deep sense of loss and disillusionment. The cost of the conflict was staggering, and the scars it left would take generations to heal. The collapse of the Central Powers marked the end of an era and the beginning of a long and arduous journey towards recovery and reconciliation. The German home front was also nearing collapse. Years of war had taken a devastating toll. Food shortages were rampant. Civilians were starving. The economy was in ruins. Anti-war sentiment grew rapidly. Protests erupted in cities across Germany. Workers went on strike. Sailors mutinied. The German people, weary of war and suffering, demanded an end to the bloodshed. Faced with mounting pressure both on the battlefield and at home, Kaiser Wilhelm II's government began to crumble. The Kaiser, once a symbol of German power and prestige, had become a liability. His authority was waning. In a desperate attempt to salvage the situation, the German government reached out to the Allies, seeking an armistice. They knew the terms would be harsh, but they had no other choice. The alternative was utter collapse. Negotiations began, shrouded in secrecy and urgency. The fate of nations hung in the balance. Section 4. The 11th Hour, Armistice, and the Guns Fall Silent. On November 11, 1918, at 5 a.m. in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, France, representatives of the Allied powers in Germany signed the armistice. The guns fell silent. The war was over. After more than 4 years of brutal conflict, the world breathed a collective sigh of relief. The fighting had stopped. The nightmare was over. A sense of disbelief mingled with overwhelming joy. News of the armistice spread like wildfire. Church bells rang out across Europe and beyond. People poured into the streets to celebrate. Strangers embraced. Tears of joy streamed down their faces. For the soldiers on the front lines, the news of the armistice was met with a mix of elation and disbelief. They had survived. They would live to see another day. Section 5. A world rejoices. Celebrations erupt worldwide. The celebrations were spontaneous and heartfelt. People from all walks of life poured into the streets, their faces alight with joy and relief. It was a moment that transcended borders, languages, and cultures. In Paris, London, New York, and countless other cities and cities around the globe, the air was filled with the sounds of laughter, music, and the clinking of glasses. Strangers embraced, united by a common sense of triumph and relief. Millions celebrated the end of the war to all wars. The euphoria was palpable. It was as if a heavy, dark cloud had finally lifted, revealing a sky full of possibilities. The world was weary of war. The years of conflict had taken a toll on everyone, from soldiers on the front lines to families waiting anxiously at home. The scars of battle were not just physical but deeply emotional. They yearned for a brighter future, a future free from the horrors they had just endured. The hope was that this hard-won peace would usher in a new era of understanding and cooperation, a future free from the horrors they had just endured. Cities began the slow process of rebuilding, and communities came together to support one another in the aftermath of devastation. The war had touched every corner of the globe, leaving no nation untouched. The shared experience of suffering and loss created a bond between countries that had once been adversaries, and its end brought a sense of shared relief and renewed hope. People dared to believe that a new chapter was beginning, one where peace and prosperity could flourish. From the battle-scarred fields of Europe, where the ground was still fresh with the memories of conflict, to the distant shores of America, where the news of peace was met with parades and public gatherings, people dared to dream of a more peaceful world. The vision of a future without war seemed within reach, a tantalizing possibility that fueled the celebrations. The armistice was not just an end to hostilities, it was a promise of a better tomorrow. It symbolized the collective desire to move forward and build a world where such a conflict would never happen again. It was a promise of a better tomorrow. Yet, amidst the jubilation, a profound sense of loss lingered. The cost of victory had been immense, and the memories of those who had perished were ever present. A profound sense of loss lingered. Millions lay dead. The grief of families who had lost loved ones was a stark reminder of the war's devastating impact. Millions more carried physical and emotional scars that would never fully heal. The returning soldiers, though hailed as heroes, faced a long road to recovery. The world had changed forever. The landscapes of cities and the hearts of people bore the marks of war. The lessons learned were etched into the collective memory of humanity. The innocence of a generation had been shattered. The young men and women who had gone to war returned with a new understanding of the fragility of life and the value of peace. The joy of peace was tempered by the sobering reality of the war's devastating toll. The celebrations were a mix of elation and reflection as people grappled with the enormity of what had been lost and what had been gained. The world had paid a heavy price. The monuments and memorials that began to appear were not just tributes to the fallen, but also reminders of the cost of conflict. The true cost of the conflict would continue to be felt for generations to come. The legacy of the war was a complex tapestry of sorrow and hope, a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring quest for peace.